And over at the White House, President Trump is sending a new message to NATO allies. Take a look at what he posted on social media. It reads, "Without the U.S., NATO is a paper tiger." He accused NATO countries of not wanting to join the fight to stop Iran or help open up the Strait of Hormuz, while also complaining about high oil prices. He even called them cowards, and he ended that long post you see there saying, "We will remember."
Donald Trump has lashed out at European allies for what he says is a lack of support on the Iran war. The US tonight forcing the closure of several Middle East embassies as Iran's retaliation escalates.
With Iran, we're going to keep doing what we've been doing, and nobody's a match for the United States, but they're not a match for the United States. It's small potatoes. That's why I'm so disappointed in NATO, because this was a test for NATO. This was a test. You can help us. You don't have to, but if you don't have, if you don't do that, we're going to remember. Just remember this in a number of months from now. Remember my statements. They have an expression, a great expression. Never forget. Never forget. Never forget.
A superpower launched a war. Its allies refused to follow. Now the same power is sending diplomats to beg for the political support that brute force could not buy. That is the contradiction at the heart of this moment. The United States and Israel struck Iran without broad allied consultation. Then Donald Trump turned around and demanded that NATO states, EU powers, and G7 partners help carry the burden. Help secure Hormuz. Help stabilize the fallout. Help legitimize the war after the fact. And when many of them refused to join on his terms, Trump did what he always does. He insulted them. He mocked them. He called them cowards. That is not strength. That is strategic overreach. Because when a state bombs first, bypasses consultation, weakens legal legitimacy, and then demands allied obedience, it is no longer leading. It is coercing. And coercion only works for so long. This is the story of what happens when projection collides with reality. The United States still has immense firepower. It can still launch wars, move fleets, and pressure allies. But what this crisis is exposing is something deeper. Military power is not the same as political control. And alliance leadership is not the same as alliance dependency. The old assumption was simple. America acts. Allies grumble. Then eventually they fall in line. But that is not what happened here. When the war on Iran began, one of the first major breaks came from Canada. Mark Carney made it clear that the United States and Israel had not properly consulted allies, including Canada. He described the situation as a failure of the international order. That mattered because it signaled something larger than one disagreement. It signaled that even close US partners were no longer willing to quietly absorb unilateral escalation and pretend it was normal. And Europe did not respond with a single voice, but the pattern was unmistakable. Germany pushed back. France pushed back. Britain kept its distance. Others stressed escalation, law, or the absence of a clear strategic plan. Some objected because they viewed the war as legally dubious. Some objected because they were never properly consulted. Some objected because they feared being dragged into an open-ended regional war with no clear endpoint. The objections varied. But the result was the same. No automatic Western rally. No instant coalition discipline. No clean alignment behind Washington's war. And that is why Trump's reaction became so revealing. He did not absorb the hesitation as a normal disagreement among allies. He treated it like betrayal. He attacked NATO allies publicly. He complained that they enjoyed the benefits of American power but would not share the burden. He wanted ships. He wanted political cover. He wanted help reopening the Strait of Hormuz. But allies were not rushing in. And that is where the gap between projection and reality became impossible to hide. Because the original image was one of overwhelming control. America looked like the state that could fight anyone, strike anywhere, and bring the system into line by sheer force of will. But when it came time to turn force into coalition politics, that image started to crack. The ships did not appear on command. The legal objections did not disappear. The diplomatic resentment did not dissolve. Instead, Washington discovered something uncomfortable. It is one thing to launch a war. It is another thing to persuade others to own it. That is why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much in this story. Hormuz is not just a narrow waterway. It is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. If Hormuz is blocked, disrupted, or too dangerous to navigate, global markets feel it fast. Oil. Gas. Insurance. Shipping. Inflation. Political pressure. Trump clearly assumed that once Hormuz became a crisis, allies would have no choice but to line up behind him. But that is not what happened either. What happened instead was far more revealing. Some allies said Hormuz must eventually be secured. But they did not accept that this meant joining Trump's war while it was still raging. Japan was cautious. European powers were cautious. They were not saying maritime security never matters. They were saying, this is not our war on your terms. That distinction is everything. Because it means even countries that depend on Gulf energy were unwilling to convert economic vulnerability into political submission. And once that happens, the logic of imperial command starts breaking down. That is the larger significance of this moment. Trump believed force would create compliance. Instead, force created distance. Distance in Europe. Distance in Canada. Distance in the wider G7. And now the same administration that tried to rule through pressure is suddenly trying to rule through persuasion. That is where Marco Rubio enters the story. Rubio is now in France, meeting G7 foreign ministers, discussing Ukraine, the Middle East, and the wider fallout of the war. That trip is not just another diplomatic stop. It is political repair work. Because after Trump's threats failed, after the insults failed, after the public bullying failed, Washington had to send a senior diplomat to try to recover what the White House had damaged. Trust. Buy-in. Legitimacy. Strategic coherence. That is what Rubio is really there to seek. Not just support for maritime security in the abstract, but a broader political buy-in for the American-Israeli handling of this war. And the fact that this is now necessary tells you how much has changed. If the old system were still functioning the way Washington prefers, Rubio would not need to be there in this way. He would not be trying to reassure. He would not be trying to clarify. He would not be trying to explain war aims to allies who are still visibly skeptical. But this is where America now finds itself. Trying to recover politically what it spent militarily. Trying to stabilize diplomatically what it destabilized strategically. And that is not the posture of a hegemon in full control. That is the posture of a hegemon discovering that even its friends have limits. And then there is the South Africa question. Because this is where the politics of the G7 become even more revealing. France has announced the guest list for the June summit. India. South Korea. Brazil. Kenya. Not South Africa. And Pretoria says it was told the United States had threatened to boycott the summit if South Africa were invited. France denies that. The United States denies that. But the allegation itself matters. Because it points to a deeper anxiety running through the whole alliance system. Who gets to be in the room? Who counts as an acceptable African voice? Who is too independent, too inconvenient, or too politically disobedient to be welcomed into a Western-led forum at a moment like this? Even if the US did not formally issue the threat, the very fact that South Africa believes it plausible says a lot about the state of Western trust and Western power. The G7 was always more than a meeting of rich states. It was also a stage on which the West performed coherence, legitimacy, and hierarchy. Now that stage is under pressure. Because the issue is no longer just whether the G7 can release a statement. The issue is whether it still represents a coherent political center. And right now, coherence is visibly thinning. On Iran, the G7 is not marching in lockstep. On consultation, the allies are not satisfied. On legality, the objections have not disappeared. On Hormuz, the willingness to help is heavily conditioned. What we are watching is not the end of the G7. But it may be the end of the illusion that the G7 still automatically functions as a unified instrument of American-led strategy. That illusion matters. Because once it weakens, the whole architecture changes. Europe starts talking more seriously about strategic autonomy. Canada acts more openly like a middle power with its own line. Japan balances dependence with legal restraint. Invited states from the global south watch carefully and measure their distance. And all of that pushes the system towards something more fragmented. More conditional. More transactional. More openly multipolar. This is why the future question matters more than the immediate headlines. What happens after this? Does Washington learn that consultation matters? Does it relearn the difference between leadership and coercion? Does it rebuild trust before the next crisis? Or does it double down on the same method? Bomb first. Demand support later. Insult allies if they hesitate. Send diplomats afterward to clean up the wreckage. Because if that second pattern continues, the consequences will go far beyond Iran. It will shape NATO. It will shape the G7. It will shape how middle powers think about US reliability. And it will accelerate the shift toward a world where American power still matters enormously, but no longer commands automatic deference from the very countries it calls partners. That is the deeper meaning of this moment. Not that America is suddenly powerless. It is still immensely powerful. But this crisis is exposing the limits of a certain style of power. The style that confuses intimidation with strategy. The style that mistakes alliance dependence for alliance loyalty. The style that assumes force can always substitute for legitimacy. It cannot. And that is why Trump's bullying failed. Because allies may still need America. But they increasingly distrust the methods through which America now tries to lead. So Rubio's mission in France is more than diplomacy. It is an admission. An admission that threats were not enough. An admission that war did not produce obedience. An admission that political buy-in has to be rebuilt because it no longer comes automatically. That is the real story. Not a superpower confidently directing its alliance system. But a superpower trying to patch together support after discovering that even fear has limits. And if that pattern holds, then the future will not be a cleaner Western bloc behind Washington. It will be something else. Messier. More conditional. More fragmented. And much less willing to confuse American pressure with Western unity. This is Liberation Lens. If this analysis helped you see beyond the headlines, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video widely. Because silence protects power. And truth only moves when people are willing to carry it. Stay alert. Stay critical. Perspective matters.